Scotland after the virus, one of the first things that people might think is, well, what on earth do we mean by after the virus? Are we really after the virus? And that, of course, is one of the questions that we look to explore in the book. And I'm conscious that there are a number of really significant landmarks as we launch this book today. One is the International Day to End Violence Against Women. And of course, domestic violence is one of the important issues touched on in a couple of chapters that has come up as a result of us living with COVID-19, an increase in domestic violence. We've also had the spending review, which has seen the UK government decide to spend vastly more on arms and cut aid to the poorest in the world in the middle of a global pandemic, indicating that perhaps earlier thoughts about building back better are going to be very demanding as we move forward. The aim of the book is hope, but at the same time, we know the challenges are really great. And also, the reality is that just today, more people have died from COVID-19 than in any previous day. So these challenges are very, very potent. But at the same time, people who've been kind enough to commend this book have highlighted the main aim of it, which is, as Elaine C. Smith says, to be a welcome tonic for dark times. And as Val McDermott said, in the dark times, we need sparks of light like this. And then Ian Hamilton QC made the very potent comment, what binds our nation, Scotland, is not birth, but love. And those were, I think, some of the sentiments that we were conscious of as we were pulling this book together, thinking about what after the virus might mean in terms of new approaches to our interconnectedness, to reimagining our public institutions, but also the connections that come through family and love and spirituality and an awareness of each other's needs and psychology. So this is a book of many voices, many perspectives. Delighted also to say that 2 of the 9 short stories are in the Scots language, and also one of the poems is in Gaelic and then translated into English. So it's also multilingual, reflecting the diversity of Scotland. So that's really to sort of set the scene for the book. You'll find within it, as well as some wonderful short stories and poems, material on the well-being economy, on racism, politics and money, justice and equality, spirituality and psychology, media, sport, probably a book that Jerry and I put together would never be absent of football entirely. Apologies for those who may struggle with that. But there are very important issues facing sport at the moment in Scotland. Mental health, old age, and of course Scotland in a changing world. So that's the kind of wider vista, if you like, but we're now going to pass on to some of the contributors. And if I can introduce them, and they'll sort of wave to you, and then I'll go to Hannah to start off with. Hannah Graham will be speaking first, and Hannah's a criminologist, senior lecturer at the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research at the University of Stirling, and she's a member of the Scottish Sentencing Council, which is an independent advisory body. And then we're delighted also to be joined by Kirstin Innes. Many will know Kirstin, front-rank writer, author of the novels Fishnet and especially Scabby Queen, which has deservedly got huge numbers of plaudits, and has written a piece for this book called Droplets. And then Kirsty Hughes, who's a writer and expert commentator on Scottish, UK and European politics and relations, and she was from 2017 to this year a director of the Scottish Centre on European Relations, which is in a little bit of abeyance at the moment, but we hope it might make a comeback in the near future. And then, of course, my good friend and colleague Jerry Hassan, who co-edited the book with me and who is a research fellow in contemporary history at Dundee University, and has authored or edited over 24 books. Every time I try to count, I lose count, and you'll know him from his columns in Sunday National and elsewhere. So thank you for the panel for joining us. And I'm going to kick off with Hannah. And Hannah, the pandemic has sort of highlighted issues of justice and inequality in Scotland. And looking to the future, what ideas and priorities do you think could be pursued?
Thanks, Simon. And that's a useful question because it offers an opportunity to showcase that the book bears witness to issues of inequality and equalities. And throughout the chapters, there's a real thread, a theme throughout multiple chapters, that there has been a plurality of experience in this pandemic. We have not experienced different issues evenly or equally. There's been issues of power that come to the fore in our experiences, and they show up in the chapters, in the essays, the poetry and the short stories. And so in terms of issues of justice and inequalities, it's very telling how we deal with different emergencies. And so I have a keen interest in Scottish politics, but have grounded my chapter in thinking about changing Scottish justice, needing courage and cooperation. And as a criminologist and a social scientist, in criminal justice in Scotland, we routinely see issues of social justice, or should I say social injustice, coming into our area. And so I guess I'm attentive to the fact that in the midst of adversity and uncertainty, the Scottish Government and a raft of contractors and community groups and others have moved heaven and earth to respond to the pandemic. And so we see examples like the NHS Louisa Jordan, a field hospital or a field service with a capacity of up to 1,000. But it is very telling how we respond to different emergencies, because in Glasgow, where the NHS Louisa Jordan is, something to be proud of, something that we want to see our health service thrive. Drug rehab beds, there are 13 in Glasgow, 13 residential drug rehab beds. And we've had other emergencies on our conscience and on our minds, like being a drugs death capital of Europe. We're also a punishment capital in Europe, so Scots punish their own at much higher rates than other societies in Europe. So residential drug rehab beds make up 1% of prison beds in my city. And also there are issues across Scotland where if you have mental health issues, you could be waiting longer than the pandemic to access psychological talking therapies. And that was before the pandemic. And so I guess I want to highlight issues of how social justice and injustice intersect. There are a lot of ideas and strategies in this book. And so we not only bear witness to issues of, there are chapters around grief, suffering, communication, of moving through the issues that have made us sad and stressed us out. But there are also a lot of chapters on what to do and how to do it. And so my chapter moves through strategies on how can we punish less. And I can tell you that what makes Scotland safer and fairer is not being a high punishment society. If you want questions on the types of strategies, feel free to ask them in the chat. But there are quite a few intersections between what I would say is a criminologist, and then what others like Oliver Escobar, and a political scientist, Michael Gray, a journalist and lawyer, would speak to on how we deal with people who disagree with us or see our futures differently. Because when I propose that we use prison less, a lot of people react to that, and understandably. So I think this is a book about the future with some strategies that will take backbone, moral and political courage. I propose things or speak about the issues like decriminalisation. We could get into the drug deaths angle of that if we wish, through to using prison less, and others are tenacious on issues of poverty and inequality. I'll leave it there, but there are so many ways of moving beyond punitive populism or what Michael Gray calls identity essentialism and those unhelpful tropes that things will never change. Actually, this is a good opportunity to have the backbone to get on and do it. And I think we've got some good examples of how that can be done. So thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Hannah. And that's an important note of both realism and hope moving forward, which is certainly what we want to capture. And there are, as you've suggested, a number of chapters in this book that look at topical issues, public policy issues and politics. But story and human experience is a really important part of it as well. And actually, Jerry and I wrote round to all the contributors so that in the final chapter we could make some reference to the personal experiences that people had had. And that's really crucial to what we're trying to do as well. But amongst the short stories, the first of the short stories is from Kirsten Innes, and it's fantastic to have you with us this evening, Kirsten. Many people have been really moved by your book, Scabby Queen, and yours is one of those short stories that tries to explore the deep human impact of this pandemic. So I wondered if you could share a little bit of that story, Droplets, and maybe say a bit about how you've been thinking about and experiencing creativity at a moment like this and moving forward.
Sure, I'll go straight into the story and then I'll pitch afterwards.
Great.
Back when all this had begun, it seemed like the best way to survive it was to imagine the experience as a crucible, a forge maybe, where all the parts that were wrong, cruel, broken could be burned away. There were hopes. Those hopes were announced and agreed with all over the internet. When all this was over, society was going to emerge. A thing everyone said a lot at first, when all this is over, talking with the same mouth about how everything and nothing would change, emerged from this leaner, bruised but resilient, a white hot new thing that gleamed and was fit for purpose. And was that the baby? And everyone meant well. There were great intentions. Within 3 days, they'd set up a local volunteer network, posted info in the windows of the shops in the high street. If you need us, we're here. She felt herself made new with the work. Doorstep drop-offs, tap door run, the dirt stuck under her children's fingernails as they pushed tiny sprouting cat tatties, khaki balls into the depths of the bags she'd lined up along the one sunny wall of their wee bit of garden. Maybe they'd grow up green-fingered, her children, freed from plastic-wrapped supermarket potatoes. When the first seedling sprouted, her daughter had thought it was a miracle, named each plant after a cartoon character. All these beginnings, all these ideas, it was terrifying, but the possibility of it, well, fundamentally changing society should be terrifying. That's the point we're trying to make. Hang on. Arms outstretched at the top of the stairs to her and a wordless keening. Back to bed, sweetheart. Shh, shh. The arm sandwiched between his heavy head and the flat little pillow began to tingle. And the relief, as she took out her phone and her thumb pulled the screen down, and in it came, because she needed to check, keep checking, because the world changed every time she hit refresh now, got worse and worse, and she needed to know, stay alert. The spike of outrage and anger, a mashing of buttons that weren't even there, just points under sensitive glass. Angry people jumping on fragments without context, spinning them into a mob, a resignation, a lack of a resignation, and a shrug, a scroll, a pull down and refresh, and on to the next. Emoji flags, like pitchforks. Face buried in the crook of her elbow, the baby raised his bum in the air and farted happily in his sleep. She had to drop the phone to muffle the laugh. In the desert, wind blowing his hair, the President of the United States thumped a Bible from the kid's bedroom rug. She might as well just sleep here again. There's a bit more than that in the story, but I thought that was a nice wee excerpt. Creativity. This is what this story looks like. This is not how I usually write. If you can see that on the page, it's all over the place, which was how my mind was working or not quite working. What I tried to do with this was try and use quite an experimental form of language expression with thoughts pushed all over the page to just sort of mimic the constant stream, the difficulty, the break in focus that was occurring, particularly with for people with caring responsibilities. The character in my story as well is somebody who could possibly be involved in building back better, but the physical lack of the village that it takes to raise a child around her takes a toll on her mental health. So that's kind of where I was going with this story.
Thanks very much. How are you sort of thinking about things moving forward in terms of your own work? Are there any trailers as to what you're working on at the moment?
I was writing an apocalyptic novel before all this started,
Right.
to do with climate change. So I've kind of paused that. But honestly, it felt quite therapeutic being able to write this piece once I'd finally found the form of it. But personally, moving forward, we're just all in this holding pen at the moment, aren't we? And that sort of surge of positivity that there was once we'd kind of got accustomed to it. I think we're all just kind of maybe waiting a little bit to see how that all reels out. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. Kirsten, thanks very much indeed. And I should mention that we've also got some fabulous poetry in the book as well, and we're hoping for a future event to highlight some of the artistic content and material. And I'm sure many of you have seen the cover already of Scotland After the Virus, and indeed it's not just the front cover, but the way it goes onto the back as well. And I should just mention at this point that we're extremely grateful to James Donald, who's an artist and weaver who contributed the image for the cover. And it came out of a little story which you'll find at the beginning of the book, because during lockdown, James was going out and taking photographs of textures and colours and creating mood boards. And so, you know, we hope that that also says something about both how we're coping and how we're looking forward as well. Okay, and next I'm going to move on to Kirsty Hughes. Great to have you with us, Kirsty. Obviously, you know, we're thinking next week about the fact that you know, the Brexit deal is going to come under focus, and along with the virus, that casts a huge shadow over how Scotland tries to shape its European relations. So really the question for you is how you see the challenges that lie ahead in this context, or at least a flavour of those challenges.
Well, thank you, Simon, and thank you to you and Jerry for editing this fascinating book. I confess I've only read a small amount so far. There's so many different contributions there. I think the question is a very big one. You know, we've had so many crunch moments in Brexit. It's quite hard to imagine that the vote was 4.5 years ago, and somehow we are outside the European Union. That happened just before everybody started to become really alert to COVID. That happened on the 31st of January this year. But we don't leave the EU single market till 1st of January next year, and somehow we've been told again and again, well, this is a crunch moment, or Boris Johnson has walked away again. But it really is a crunch few days coming up. We are literally almost out of time, and it's quite extraordinary in that to hear decent media sources suggesting Boris Johnson hasn't quite made his mind up if he wants the very basic deal he's negotiating, or would prefer, in the midst of this COVID crisis, the additional chaos of a no-deal Brexit. And Rishi Sunak keeps talking about, you know, with his budget today, and talking about how to tackle, rightly talking about how to tackle the economic crisis out of COVID, without actually talking about the parallel and longer term impact of Brexit. And a number of economists have looked at this in detail indeed, and suggested that the UK economy in the end will be harder hit over the next decade by Brexit than even by this extraordinary COVID crisis. I think trying to bring out a few positive tales in this. At the start of the crisis, obviously for Europe, it especially took off in Italy, and the EU stumbled quite a bit then. Not only was and is health mostly devolved to individual member states, but the emergency coordination mechanisms that were there didn't work very well to begin with. But then if you fast forward to today, and where we are 7-8 months later, we've seen the EU do joint procurement on PPE, put in huge joint procurement for COVID vaccines. We've obviously seen the UK government sadly choose to just go down its own path and not participate in that. And we've seen an extraordinary effort in the summer for the EU to create a very, very big recovery fund and even give the European Commission, for the first time ever, the right to go out and raise funds on the financial markets and to give a big part of that money to countries, member states who need it, as grants, not as loans. So I think there's a lot of hopeful stuff there. You know, some people said, or some Brexiters hoped the EU would be done down by Brexit, but actually in the end, and 4.5 years later, we see that in a funny way, the EU unified around the Brexit challenge to defend what the EU is for and also to move forward. And when you look at that recovery fund, I was just talking about the European Recovery Fund, quite rightly, there's an effort to make a big chunk of that focus on green issues and to link it back to the big aims of the European Green Deal. Where does Scotland fit into all that, and can we be hopeful about Scotland? You know, at one level it's quite difficult, obviously. Scotland didn't vote to leave the European Union. It's had almost no say. It's tried to have a say in the talks between the UK and EU, but essentially been ignored. But I think because it voted Remain, that's been very much noticed in Brussels and in other European capitals. On the whole, EU member states are not going to get involved if there's another Scottish independence referendum, but there's a lot more understanding of that as a possibility, understanding of how and why that might happen. And I think in a way, I mean, for a lot of people, you know, part of the reason the support for independence has gone up since the summer, you know, to a clear majority for now in the polls for independence is partly because of COVID. There are also people who voted Remain, who used to say no to independence, who are now saying yes to independence. So I think it's made people think again about, well, is there a choice between two unions here, between the UK and the EU? But I also think, just to end on this maybe, I think there's wider things we all need to think about in thinking about Europe. Brexit may have happened, but we're still a European island. We don't usually talk about Britain or Scotland and England or the UK in that way, but we're a European island and a bit with Northern Ireland. And I've been talking to a lot of EU commentators and officials recently for another paper I've just published on how the EU sees the UK at the moment. And although there's a lot of very negative views there, not surprisingly, about the UK, there's a repeated interest in building a better, more positive, closer relationship, and the hope that perhaps if there's a thin trade deal, that can happen. I think the people in the EU are much more alert, at least than UK politicians, to the fact that we're near geographic neighbours. We're not moving this island anywhere, and even if Scotland does become independent and perhaps independent in the EU at some point, it's still going to be geographically where it is, and both England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland all have to think how they strengthen and if they want to strengthen their multiple European links.
Great, thanks very much for that. That again opens up a lot of issues I'm sure people will want to ask questions about. And just to say, actually, the questions are starting to come in on chat. Please do add your comments or questions. And Bill Ramsey and Linda Henry have asked questions already. And just to say to them that when we move into the questions in a few minutes, I might ask you to ask them yourselves so that we get a variety of voices in this conversation. And I'm going to finally hand over to my friend and co-editor, Jerry Hassan. This is the third book on Scotland that Jerry and I have worked on together, and that's been a real pleasure. And we, of course, have contributed together an introduction and also an afterword, not in order to have the first and last word, but in order perhaps to point out where the conversation about Scotland after the virus is coming from and where it's going. But Jerry, I mean, what we tried to do with this book was to recognise that the impact of the personal should have an impact on our politics, and likewise politics will have an impact on our personal experiences as well as we try to live in and beyond the pandemic. So I wondered if you could say a little bit about what that means for you and for the contributions that you've made to this.
Thank you for that, Simon, and thank you for all those great contributions so far. That gave me a lot to think about. it was funny when we first thought of this book, because first of all, when we thought about it, it became initially a challenge to me, because we didn't then think of it and plan it in a very in a conventional way. We didn't sit down with a template and think X, Y, Z. It developed a bit while we were thinking about these different genres and different styles, which was there from the outset. And then actually what happened was it became something that it's also, when you work together longer term and the challenge of COVID and so on, and all these brilliant contributions, it I think became something much more enjoyable for us and more inspiring, and hopefully for other people too. My original hope about the book was a hope, and to be an inspiration, a little bit of an invitation to think beyond afterward, and also a little bit of a provocation. I think the words that were most important were hope, mixed with also trying to, I think it was Hannah used the word witness. It was a sense of capturing something of this moment, this watershed moment, and then thinking what happens and changes and what happens after that, and exploring the human imagination in different ways through that. And one of the big things for me, which is, I sometimes explain the book to people by saying it's not a political book, and they said, well, of course it's a political book, but it's a book which the politics are different. It was trying to combine the big things in life with the very human things, and recognising the importance that the small things really matter. So yes, there's big existential questions in this book about the economy and the planet and capitalism. But I think Simon's already touched on this. That's not the way most people live their lives. Most people don't go around their lives thinking about abstracts like, my God, what are we going to do about the 1%? Or you know, they think about the power of the local and the immediate and the relationships they have, and the power of relationships, good and bad, because when they're bad, they often really determine people's lives. When they're good, they aid them. And I think I just want to say two quick other things about context. One is that I think through all my politics, practically for all my adult life, I've been struggling to find a language that is about the challenges we face, given all sorts of things. And I think in COVID and with the changing nature of Britain, there is an issue of brutality in some language, along with all the wonderful things that have happened, and a brutal language used by some on the right, which is, I'm just going to use one example here because it's very prevalent, is the language of our fellow Scots, Andrew Neil and Fraser Nelson, who have been taking to the airwaves in the last few weeks to talk about Scotland and public health and life expectancy, comparing Scotland to, and the East End of Glasgow particularly, to sub-Saharan Africa. And I've been using figures that are 20 years out of date on that, with their usual, insider class arrogance, etc., and getting lots of time for that. And there's kind of a desperation there, and a kind of inhumanity and arrogance, etc. But what it's about is trying to diminish and depower us. And it's just not really very helpful, but it's symptomatic of something more. And so my final observation is, which I think really relates to some of this stuff and has happened during the COVID pandemic, is the Netflix series, The Crown. Now, for people that don't want to watch something about the royals, this is an insider account. Part of it's fiction and over-dramatised, but an insider account of the British establishment. And what I think it tells us is, because the parts of the ruling class hate this, is it's telling us some truths that have never been told. It also tells us how the royal family and that institution infantilizes us. And it makes us, I think, strangers in our own home. And I think it raises the question, which is much, much bigger than independence and much, much bigger than whether we remain in the United Kingdom, maybe even bigger than Brexit, And it says, when will this be our house? And when will we make our own rules? Because we don't do that in Britain. And I think that's one of the things about why a whole pile of people like Richard Dimbleby and Penny Junor and so on, they hate the Crown, because we're having, some truths finally told. And those are big questions that, hopefully we can begin to ask and answer after the virus.
Great. Thanks very much indeed, Jerry. Again, a whole series of comments that open up discussion. And again, we're aware this evening that we're giving you a taster, and that's partly because we want you to buy the book, but partly that we want to get a number of voices in. So thank you for the comments that are continuing to come in on chat, and the praise from Elizabeth Williams and Loretta Mulholland, and Katrina Caldwell. Thanks very much for that. I'm going to ask Linda Hendry if she wants to pose her question, which I think will be to Hannah, particularly on one aspect. So if you could come in with that question, Linda.
Hannah was, because like her, I want to reduce the prison population. My father was a sheriff, so I was brought up with the prison population from a very young age and how many of them shouldn't have been in jail but should have been somewhere else. And I think she mentioned decriminalisation, and I just wondered if anywhere in the book you get as close to cleaning out the prisons of drug users as legalising cannabis, far less any other drugs, because cannabis is now a legal medicine. The Scottish
Thank you, Linda, for the question. Yeah, it's just one of the issues that comes up time and time again. As a criminologist and a social scientist that's done quite a bit of work in health, substance use and alcohol use comes up in many projects and initiatives. So the links between justice, health and welfare are quite strong. And I think the pandemic has brought that to the fore. As you rightly point out, we've had long policy and practice discussions as well as listening to lived experience in Scotland around decriminalisation or around legalisation. In a sense, it doesn't entirely matter whether I or other authors highly advocate one over the other. I like to see the spectrum of things that are possible. I'm very much so in the position of decriminalisation and things around harm reduction and support, meeting people where they're at and supporting recovery. And I think that we have seen an urgency for some time that is starting to go on and on and on. And we're about to get some more statistics. And it's of Scotland's drug deaths, and then there are broader drug-related harms. We haven't lacked conversations from public health experts or clinicians about this issue. Sure, it hasn't been Jason Leach and the First Minister every day on a separate health minister, but we have not lacked conversations about this at Westminster or at Holyrood, among practitioners, among people with lived experience. And yet in my chapter, I bring attention to a column that SNP MP Kenny McCaskill wrote around the urgency of the things that we know and yet don't act on, around punishment, but also approaches to people who are at risk of drug-related harms and deaths. And he said earlier in the pandemic, if we don't do something soon, we ain't seen nothing yet. If we want Train Spotting to remain a movie and not return to being a reality, we need to be bold. And so in my chapter, I ask, is Scotland a progressive nation with a punitive streak? Or perhaps I could be even more provocative and say intransigence, or are we actually slightly more fit and yet we position ourselves and are known as Scotland the Brave? And so I think that, yes, there are constitutional stouches that are had. In terms of my own personal politics, my blunt answer would be bring on Scottish independence, and then I have a series of strategies I'd like to see. But I understand that other people would not agree with that, and that's fine. I respect that. But I think within the remit of what's possible in the Scottish Parliament, what's possible by the Lord Advocate, what's possible by Police Scotland, and then what's possible with our public health authorities, we are crying out for far more in terms of resources, time and access to evidence-based treatment, harm reduction, recovery support facilities. And I would have preferred that the law changed before activists and campaigners like Peter Crikant and Paul Sweeney have taken the action that they have. But it hasn't yet. And yet, if there's a lesson from this pandemic that multiple chapters in this book touch on in different spheres of Scottish society and public life, is that in the midst of a crisis, we can have rapid change, that it's actually hard to imagine how we go back, what was life like before we actually did it this way. So mountains that we've been around for years do not necessarily have to be that way. So I suggest that The Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament know what the options are. Some healthy and vocal scrutiny is worthwhile, some activism is worthwhile, and some action. And then also calling out the voices that try and make this politically expedient. So in terms of punishment, as well as drug-related harms, there's stigma and there's moralising, and there's people whose political agenda it will serve to say these different issues on the justice side are soft-touch justice. The Scottish Conservatives have used the pandemic to launch a raft of get tough on crime and have more punishment initiatives, and they've spoken about we should have acts where people should be sentenced to die in prison, so lifelong prison sentences. And putting my evidence-based hat on, it's nonsense. It's not going to work. It's very flawed policy. But also in terms of as a society and as a community, we need the mechanisms and the forums that this book and other panels and events have called for to say where are we at on this and how do we bring different people towards a place of consensus. And so people have said, well, why isn't drugs in a citizens' assembly, or why isn't punishment coming to the fore in that area? So we don't lack ideas, we don't lack strategies, we don't lack people willing to do them. We just need some bravery to get on and actually do some of it, and it will take multiple people cooperating for that to happen.
Thanks very much. That's a pretty substantial answer. I'm going to bring in, just to say before I bring in the next question, I think the answer to why everybody's video is turned off is that this is being live streamed and it's also being recorded. And so there will be questions of permissions that need to be gone through formally if everyone was immediately visible. So please don't anybody take it personally, but I imagine that that's the reason for it. But I'm going to bring in Bill Ramsey and hoping that that Kirsty might have a chew at the question that Bill is about to ask.
Any discourse, and it seems to be not a great deal, about Scottish international relations in a wide sense, it seems quite narrow. I understand the focus on the EU at the moment, but in a wider sense, it's about a question I'm asking about: does Scotland have its own geopolitical characteristics? Because absent the EU debate, which is very important at the moment and is central, politicians, particularly in my beloved party, keep talking about the part of the world we live in is a dangerous and uncertain place. So if it were them, I would put the following cheeky question, but it's not meant in a cheeky way to the panelists, and I'm sure they realise that. At what point in the ferry from Ireland to Scotland should the purser announce over the tannoy, warning, warning, you're leaving a geopolitically sleepy hollow and entering a dangerous and uncertain world? I find this dangerous and uncertain world strapline very British, and even Britain's really in a geopolitical sleepy hollow. You know, if you imagine an onion and it's the left and it's held half and it's the side, you've got Ireland, then you've got UK and France, then you've got Norway at the top, and then right down to Italy. Then you've got another slice where you've got Sweden and the Balkans down, and then you've got Finland right down to Greece. So I can identify at least 5 or 6 different onion rings before you get to the part of the world where the geopolitical instabilities sort of kick in. What about Scotland? I mean, is it in a geopolitically sleepy hollow? I mean, I don't expect this to be as secure and as isolated, if you want to put it that way, as New Zealand, but you know, are we really living in a very dangerous and uncertain region of the world?
I think you've got 2 really interesting questions there, because your first question, which I saw in the chat function, you know, does Scotland have distinct geopolitical features? You could do a whole book on that, you know, how about it, Jerry and Simon? But then you also develop that into, you know, does Scotland live in a particularly dangerous bit of the world? And I guess you're hinting there as well at some of the kind of anti-independence arguments. I mean, I think we all, I mean, and this comes back to COVID, we actually all live in a rather dangerous world at the moment, and it's not dangerous only because of COVID, which is, as you know, it's global, but it's so easy to get drawn into only looking at what's happening in your own country or your own state. But obviously, we're waiting. As I said earlier, the UK will be leaving the EU single market, but to my mind, much more positively, Joe Biden will be taking over the presidency of the United States, because under Trump's presidency, and when we've looked at the standoffs between America and China and so on, the world is not in a great place. I was starting to think about your question when I saw it in the chat function. You know, what bits of foreign policy or geopolitics does a country create, and what is sort of intrinsic? And one first answer to that would be to say geography is very important. You know, so you look at Scotland's coastline, or if you go, as I have done in the past, you go and talk to people in Norway, or you talk to people in Finland, as you mentioned, and what they'll say are their sort of security issues are different to what you'll hear if you go to Greece. And I was talking to a number of people in different EU member states for a paper I wrote at the start of the year. And it was very interesting. I remember talking to people in Ireland, and they were saying, look, now the UK's gone, we have to show more interest in other member states, like perhaps Latvia and Lithuania, and we don't understand very well their geopolitical concerns about Russia. Obviously, we've got a big picture of Russia, but what's it like to be Latvia and Lithuania? And if we want them to care about our Irish concerns, we need to understand their concerns as well. So no, in terms of your second question, Scotland is not in a uniquely dangerous position. It's not bordering Russia. It's you know, it's not dealing. That opens up another huge issue. It's not dealing on the front line of the migration challenge in the Mediterranean, for instance. And actually, you know, it's not that tongue-in-cheek to say Scotland's most unstable neighbour at the moment is England, if you look at English politics. And that, whether Scotland was independent or not, that doesn't go away. Though obviously if Scotland was a separate state, how you might look at that neighbour, England, would change. And again, talking to people recently in France, in Ireland, in Denmark, in Sweden, they're all very concerned at not just at Brexit, but at the way the UK's politics has been so, what they see as out of character in the last few years. So I better leave it there, but I think that's just scratching the surface of your very interesting questions.
Thanks very much indeed, Kirsty, and thanks for the other comments that are coming in, some responses to Hannah. Chris Scott has made a wee bit of a protest about the heavy politics, looking for something a bit more positive and creative. So perhaps I can move into a slightly different area. In a few minutes, I'm going to ask Jerry to say something about viviculture, which was something that came up in the previous book that we did, and it also comes in the last chapter of this. But another question that's come into me is for Kirsten. And towards the end of your story, Kirsten, Droplets, I'll just read the quote that someone's drawn my attention to. Build back better. Her handwriting on an envelope tucked away behind the toaster, underlined, red biro. She had no memory of writing it. And I suppose, you know, looking at the creative side of things, that phrase "build back better," which you brought into the story, I wonder if you've got any thoughts yourself on what that means or what that looks like from a creative point of view.
Yeah, what I was thinking about with this story was just that the people who had that energy to really make some sort of change at a very local level, it seemed to be. I live in a small community, small village, and right at the start of lockdown, we set up a volunteer network. My partner's now still running a food bank out of the local Masonic Hall. There are community gardens. We've been kind of setting up supplies and kind of growth projects and this sort of thing. And it just felt like everybody had all this energy and hit a wall of exhaustion somewhere around the 4th or 5th month, possibly at the time I was writing this story, actually. And what Jerry was saying about the personal and the political there, I think this isn't quite specifically about creative, but I think we're going to need some sort of way of kind of dealing with the effects of this year. Even if you haven't personally been, physically affected by COVID, just the stopping of routine, the people have been, the effects of lockdown, the psychological effects of lockdown on people, the rifts that have kind of riven up between just in communities, resentments about, I don't know, I mean, I feel quite resentful for somebody for not wearing a mask if I see them in the shop, without stopping to ask if there's a reason. There's and the way that people have become dependent on social media, and that's sort of whipped up. Social media encourages short form thought only, which seems to me the opposite of what we need if we do truly want to build back better, which in itself is a nice little short form thought that somebody must have come up with. That was the original title for my story, actually. I don't know, I just think there's just we need to have some conversations, creative, non-creative, just sitting there about how to heal. I think a healing process is needed at a kind of community level and at a personal level for in order to get back that sense of energy and the sense of possibly making change.
Yeah, thanks very much, Kirsten.
Yeah.
I'm going to move on to Jerry now, and as it happens, I was going to ask you to say something a little bit, Jerry, about viviculture and how that might inspire and encourage us. But there is a question, Ariel Killick has said, for Jerry and all, what hope do you have for the creative sector heavily reliant on precariously employed freelancers, of whom there are, I think, a number of us in the room now, which has been catastrophically destroyed this year and most wholly unemployed and largely unsupported since March? What future and hope do you really think creatives will see in our political and media leaders so focused on football and hospitality? That's very true, and retail, and largely ignoring arts and culture. So there's a question about that sector, a number of chapters in the book dealing with that. Jerry.
So viviculture, I'm not sure if viviculture is a good sounding word or a horrible sounding word. It's certainly a distinctive word because it sounds a bit like a detergent to me or something. I can see it like, new viviculture. The word comes from, it's not widely used, but it was introduced in a Fintan O'Toole essay trying to understand what was going on in England vis-a-vis Brexit. And in it he meant, because it isn't a pseudo word, it is a proper word, it means love of life and love, a real love and celebration of culture. And I think it's something, I mean, I think this is where I head into controversial territory. I'll try not to go too far, is I think in lots of our critiques of Britain, we tend to miss the fact that Scotland, with a parliament, isn't that democratic a land either. And underneath all that, there's lots of stuff in our public life where we just like take things and don't talk about them. The missing voices, the fact that we've had, this is a political point, 50% turnouts for all these Scottish Parliament elections, half the country missing, et cetera, and that's the poorer Scotland, the younger Scotland, the Scotland already struggles in lots of ways, and parts of our politics, Labour, SNP, Tory, until we got to Indie Ref, was just never really commented on, and I found that astounding. I think what a viviculture would look like would be there are, I don't need to name them, but there's brilliant organisations doing community work and doing stuff that is also national stuff that have changed Scotland for the better and dealt with really tough stuff on domestic violence, on gender violence, on knife crime, etc. And we don't do enough of that, I guess, because it's difficult and getting the support and leadership and funding for it. And I think that brings me to the culture point. God, that's a subject that, we've got a couple of chapters on it in the book that are mixed with an amazing ecology and plethora of emotions, from anger and rage to brilliant humour. I mean, that is absolutely amazing. And the only thing I can say about it, really, in a way that I can't do it justice in a minute, is we will be in the new year doing a specific event on this with arts practitioners. Not that will provide all the answers, but it's just such a big subject. And it brings us back to the bigger questions, even, well, how do we sustain our society? And, 11.3% drop in GDP, the biggest of a developed country, apparently, in the world. And it isn't going to be build back better. It's going to be restoration. And that's not what a lot of us want, because it wasn't very good for a lot of people in the first place.
Thanks very much, Jerry. Well, we are drawing rapidly to a close here. It's amazing how an hour passes. So I think all I really need to do is to thank everyone for taking part in this launch. There are going to be other events, as we've mentioned, following up. We're going to be able to go into much more detail on some of the themes picked up in the book. And Jerry, we have the next one planned. I wonder if you just want to say something about that.
We do indeed. We're going to do a series of 6 events on the book. We're going to do 1 before Christmas to kind of start them off, and then 5 just into the run into spring. So the first one is December the 15th, which from my memory, is that Tuesday? I can't remember if it's a Tuesday or anyway, December the 15th, 6:30, and that is on the kind of human cost of COVID and to society, and how we kind of assess that and come out of it. And that's with the psychologist Suzanne Zeedyk, and also with the academic who covers a range of areas of academia around ethnicity, race, identity, racism, Tommy Curry. So that will be, and other speakers, but that will be a great start.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. And also, Morven Cunningham has said, did Jerry mention that there was going to be a culture-specific event in the new year? And the answer to that's yes, I think, isn't it? As I say, we're planning a range of events which will run under the Luath Press banner. We're also looking to team up with other organisations and people on some of the subjects as well, which is important. There's one tomorrow night connected to the forthcoming SNP conference, but we hope different political groups will get involved. And we're looking, as I say, at working with people involved with the media, maybe with NUJ Scotland on stuff to do with the media and Scotland and the pandemic and so on. So if people have ideas, please do drop us a note, and Jerry and I can be contacted in a variety of ways. Our email addresses are in the book, and we're also on Twitter. I think probably all the contributors you'll find on Twitter, so you can contact them that way. So it just remains me to say, once again, a big thank you to Luath Press, a huge thank you to all our contributors, and a thank you to everyone else who's taken part in this and those who've asked questions and made comments tonight.